On the 24th of January 1848, James W. Marshall was examining the sawmill he was constructing for John Sutter when he noticed something unusual. The night before, he had diverted water through the mill's tail race to clear away loose dirt and gravel. And that morning, he spotted small, gleaming flecks of metal left behind in the channel. Those few shiny specks would ignite what became the California Gold Rush. On the 2nd of February 1848, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo brought the present-day states of California, Nevada, Utah, Arizona, and parts of New Mexico, Colorado, and Wyoming to the United States, known as the Mexican Cession. On the 9th of September 1850, California became the 31st state. All these events led to California becoming a dangerous place for the Native Americans in the region as it brought violence, land seizures, and enslavement, while the federal government offered little protection. By 1851, Governor Peter Burnett warned that unless Indians were removed east of the Sierra Nevada, a war of extermination would continue until they were extinct. In Central California, the Yokuts at first lived and worked alongside settlers, but mounting abuses and pressure on their homelands pushed tensions toward violence. By the spring of 1856, those tensions erupted near present-day Porterville at a place called Battle Mountain during a conflict known as the Tule River War. Well, let's get into it, shall we? My name is Stephen, and welcome to Wild West Deep Dives. For thousands of years before Europeans arrived, the Yokuts lived across the heart of California's Central Valley. They were not a single tribe, but a large cultural and linguistic group made up of as many as 60 distinct bands, each with its own leaders, villages, and customs. Most Yokut communities were built along rivers, streams, and the shores of Tule Lake, once a massive lake and in the 1850s the largest body of fresh water west of the Great Lakes. In this rich wetland environment, the Yokuts developed a stable and productive way of life centered on hunting, fishing, and gathering with acorns as a dietary staple and fish, waterfowl, elk, deer, and antelope supplementing their food supply. Yokut society was tightly organized and deeply connected to the natural world. Villages could number several hundred people and were governed by chiefs and sub-chiefs, while families followed well-defined social customs involving marriage, residence, and kinship rules. Men hunted, fished, and built, while women gathered food, processed acorns, maintained homes, and raised children. Tule reeds from the marshes were essential, used to build homes, baskets, mats, and cradles. The Yokuts were skilled basket makers and traders, exchanging obsidian, salt, and goods with neighboring tribes such as the Chumash and Miwok, using shell money known as keha. And I'm sorry if I'm saying those names incorrectly. Their spiritual life revolved around ceremonies tied to mourning, harvest cycles, and puberty rites, reflecting a belief that powerful spirits inhabited the land and governed balance and survival. According to Legends of America, the estimate of pre-contact population was 18,000 in 1770, but more modern estimates go as high as 70,000 individuals living in the region. European contact began in the late 18th century with Spanish expeditions, but it was the mission system that brought the first great upheaval. As missions expanded, Yokuts were forced into labor under harsh conditions that spread diseases and caused massive population loss. Malaria outbreaks in the 1830s, brought by British fur trappers, devastated entire villages. Many Yokuts fled inland to escape the missions, while others adapted by working on ranches or trading livestock taken during raids against Spanish and Mexican settlements. By the time the United States took control of California after the Mexican-American War, the Yokuts' population had already been severely reduced. The final blow came with the discovery of gold in 1849. The 1850s proved catastrophic as American miners and settlers flooded the valley, seizing land, draining water sources, and committing widespread violence. The long slide toward war in the Tule River country began years before the first shots of 1856 were fired, rooted in fear, rumor, and cycles of retaliation that steadily erased any chance of restraint. As early as 1849, miners moving into the Kings River region wrote eastward that gold was plentiful, but the Indians were hostile and drove prospectors away. To the Yokuts, these newcomers were not merely trespassers, but a direct threat to their survival, crowding rivers, cutting oak groves, and competing for the same resources that sustained village life. What settlers called hostility often amounted to resistance against intrusion. But in frontier correspondence, it quickly became framed as savagery. The first major bloodshed came in December of 1850, when John Wood and a small party of settlers attempted to establish a town along the Kaweah River. According to multiple accounts, Yokut leaders warned the group to leave within 10 days, threatening death if they remained. The settlers agreed to go, but lingered an extra day while gathering supplies for their journey. During that delay, they were attacked. 11 were killed outright, 2 escaped wounded, and Wood made a desperate last stand in his cabin before being captured. After killing several of the Yokut attackers, he was overpowered and skinned alive on a tree. The brutality of his death seared itself into settler memory and became a defining symbol of the Yokuts' atrocity, retold repeatedly in newspapers and later histories. Yet, even early writers admitted the underlying cause of the attack was unclear. The settlers had been allowed to build a house and were given time to leave, suggesting that hostility was neither immediate nor inevitable. Some speculated that northern tribes influenced the decisions, who had had more experience with Americans and a deeper hatred, or that the settlers had provoked the Yokuts and it soured relations. But no clear explanation has ever been given. In the months that followed, violence flared up again when cattlemen moving herds to the Four Creeks region were attacked. Pedro Lopez, driving livestock north from Los Angeles, stopped to rest near Four Creeks, where his herd mingled with cattle belonging to Captain Dorsey. A large group of Indians emerged from nearby oak groves and killed Lopez, Dorsey, and several vaqueros. These incidents reinforced the belief among settlers that the Yokuts were an organized threat, though they also reflected mounting desperation as game disappeared and grazing lands were overtaken by livestock. Each killing hardened positions and made compromise increasingly unlikely. Federal officials attempted to halt the downward spiral through treaties. In 1851, bands of Yokuts agreed to give up claims around Four Creeks in exchange for reservations, protection, livestock, and supplies. One treaty was signed at John Wood's gravesite itself, a bitter irony noted even at the time. But while the Yokut honored their end of the agreement, the U.S. Senate rejected all 18 California treaties in 1852, leaving the land open to settlement. But the Yokuts were never informed. What settlers saw as a legal victory was for the Yokuts a silent betrayal. Promised protection vanished overnight and settlers moved freely onto the land Indians believed was guaranteed to them. In the summer of 1852, William Campbell and others established a trading post and ferry on land promised to the Yokuts. When Choinimni leaders demanded they leave and cut the ferry loose to make their point, Campbell raised an armed posse. Led by Walter Harvey, a former West Point cadet turned miner, the group rode to a Choinimni village while many of the men were away working. When the Yokuts attempted to flee, Campbell fired first. 11 Indians were killed. Harvey's reputation as an Indian fighter made him a local hero, and he was soon elected county judge. The message was unmistakable. Violence against Indians brought status, not punishment. The situation briefly teetered at 2 pieces when James Savage, an Indian subagent who was respected by many Yokuts, tried to mediate. He urged restraint and arranged a meeting between tribal leaders and Army Commander George W. Patton. I double-checked it was not the World War II four-star General Patton. He wasn't born yet, and it's spelled differently, and there's no relation. But Savage's efforts ended abruptly when he encountered Judge Harvey at Campbell's trading post. After accusing Harvey of murder, the two men fought. Harvey calmly drew his pistol and killed Savage in front of witnesses. Though Patton arrested him, political pressure forced Harvey's release, and he was later acquitted. With Savage dead, the one white intermediary, trusted by the Yokuts, was gone, and faith in American justice collapsed. But for a time, the region appeared calm. Yokuts were placed on reservations. Soldiers were stationed nearby, and Army officers reported peaceful relations. As late as 1855, Captain Ed Townsend noted that the Indians lived quietly, worked for settlers, and showed no hostility. But this peace was thin and deceptive. New gold discoveries along the Kern River brought another flood of miners while cattle and hogs devoured acorn groves and root fields. Hunger returned and desperate Yokuts began taking livestock, not in organized raids, but in small acts of survival that settlers interpreted as warfare. The final spark came in 1856 with a rumor that swept through the valley like wildfire. 500 head of cattle had been stolen and driven into the mountains. This story, however, quickly unraveled. First, the number dropped to 100. Then it was said the cattle had been recovered, and finally the real truth emerged. One calf had been taken, possibly even from his own father's herd. contributed by a young man named Packwood for a wedding feast with his Indian wife's family. Some settlers recognized the exaggeration and protested, but they were ignored. Frontier rumor, as so often in the West, proved more powerful than fact. Volunteers mobilized. Indian camps were attacked without investigation, and unarmed people were killed. Fearing extermination, Yokut warriors gathered in the mountains along the Tule River, while elders, women, and children fled the valley. By the spring of 1856, moderation was gone. Rumor had replaced truth, and war was no longer a question of if but when. Once open fighting began, most Yokuts avoided direct confrontation. Families scattered in the Tule marshes, some found shelter among sympathetic settlers near Visalia, and others fled toward the Sierra foothills. But one large group chose to stand their ground. They established a fortified village at the base of a small mountain on the north fork of the Tule River, using boulders, brush, timber, and the surrounding terrain to create a strong defensive position. This was not a hastily thrown-together camp, but a deliberately chosen stronghold that controlled the open ground in front of it and was shielded on the flanks and rear by dense chaparral. On the 28th of April, 1856, Forrest DeMasters, I also read that his name may have been DeMasters. I'm going to stick with DeMasters. But he led a large volunteer force, over 100 men, up the Tule River in search of what they believed was the main body of hostile Indians. These men were not soldiers. They had no formal training, no unified command structure, and no clear tactical plan. Moving like hunters rather than an army, they followed signs of smoke rising in the distance. When the brush opened into a small plain, DeMasters' men suddenly realized what they had found. The Yokuts were dug in behind a continuous line of breastworks stretching hundreds of yards across the hillside. Even the settlers later admitted the position was admirably chosen and skillfully constructed. DeMasters, confident that rifles alone would give his men the advantage, ordered an attack. Now this may sound crazy, but remember the Yokuts were armed with bows and arrows and possibly a few flintlock pistols. So his initial thinking wasn't totally wild, but as you'll see, he was not correct. As the volunteers crossed the open ground, they were met by a sudden shower of arrows tipped with flint and hardwood. The fire forced the men to recoil into cover almost immediately. The Yokuts held their line, and when the volunteers tried to press closer, it became clear that the fort would not be taken by a quick rush. Recognizing both the strength of the position and the limits of his force, DeMasters withdrew about a mile and went into camp to wait for reinforcements. The first contact of the war had already demonstrated something many settlers did not expect. The Yokuts were organized, disciplined in defense, and capable of holding their ground. While this standoff was developing at the fort, a separate and deadly incident unfolded elsewhere. A small party of 9 mounted settlers, tracking a band of Tejon Indians believed to be responsible for earlier cattle thefts. They followed their trail through the night toward White River. Near dawn, they heard dogs barking and cautiously advanced on foot. When a single Indian stepped forward to investigate the noise, one of the whites at the direction of John W. Williams fired and killed him. The settlers then charged the camp, firing rapidly. 5 Indians were found dead, with none of the whites injured, and the attackers quickly withdrew, unwilling to pursue the scattered survivors in the wooded terrain. At the time, it was assumed that this band had been a raiding party, but nothing was ever proven. Later accounts suggest they may have simply been traveling home with women among them. When the 9 men rejoined DeMasters' camp, it was obvious that nothing could be accomplished against a fortified position without more manpower. Williams was dispatched south to Keysville to raise reinforcements. Riding hard through Lynn's Valley, Poso Flat, and over Greenhorn Mountain, he reached some mining camps along the Kern River the next day. Their roughly 60 miners agreed to join the expedition and immediately set out for Tule River. By the time they arrived, additional settlers had filtered in from across the valley. With numbers swelling, Sheriff W.G. Poindexter was elected commander. He now had roughly 140 men under his direction. Now this number confused me a bit, but I think it's because some of the settlers, after the failed initial attack, just went home. Remember, this isn't the army. But Poindexter ordered a renewed advance against the Yokuts fort. The volunteers attacked from the front, firing continuously into the breastworks while attempting to shield themselves with whatever cover the terrain allowed. The Yokuts fought back steadily, loosing arrows through gaps in their defense. Several defenders stood boldly in the open, firing until struck down. Despite the volume of fire, the attackers could not dislodge them. 2 young Americans, Danielson and Saint, John were badly wounded, and another, Thomas Falbert, was struck in the thigh but continued fighting. After failing to achieve any real breakthrough, Poindexter ordered a withdrawal. The Yokuts pursued briefly, yelling and firing arrows, but fell back once the volunteers reached open ground and returned fire. That night exposed just how fragile the volunteer force really was. Sentries were posted, but a false alarm came when a sentry fired on a man returning unseen to camp, and it threw the entire force into chaos. Men grabbed the wrong weapons, shouted conflicting warnings, and milled about in confusion before some type of order was restored. It was a sharp reminder that this was not the U.S. Army. It was a mob with rifles, angry, determined, and dangerous, but undisciplined. For days afterward, little changed. Skirmishing continued. Indian food caches were destroyed, and talk of a decisive charge filled the camp. William Lynn devised padded armor meant to protect attackers from arrows made from cotton padding and canvas tarps, earning its wearers the nickname Petticoat or Cotton Bag Brigade. But no such grand assault ever materialized. Peaceful Yokuts near Visalia, who had taken no part in the fighting, were driven out simply because they were Indians. Some settlers even proposed exterminating a non-combatant village under cover of darkness. The plan only thwarted when the intended victims fled in time, warned by friendly settlers of the impending attack. Reports spread of a statewide Indian uprising, of atrocities of miners being slaughtered, of hundreds of warriors pouring off the reservations. Mining and ranching operations halted. Families fled into towns, and places like Keysville on the Kern River began digging entrenchments with picks and shovels. Here again, the record shows the pattern I highlighted in the lead-up to this, quote, war. Numbers inflated, threat stories multiplied, and fear becomes its own engine. Some papers, like the Los Angeles Star, printed claims like 10 miners killed and 400 head of cattle driven off, while local meetings in Los Angeles declared almost decisively that Keysville's miners could handle themselves. On the 6th of May at Fort Tejon, Lieutenant Colonel Benjamin Beall, an experienced veteran of both the Seminole and Mexican Wars, dispatched Lieutenant Benjamin Alston, a West Point graduate of the class of 1853, with 37 troopers of Company A, 1st Dragoons, to relieve what were believed to be the besieged miners at Keysville. At the same time, department headquarters ordered a second column into the field. 25 red-legged infantrymen from Company K, not to be confused with the Kansas Redlegs during the Civil War, of the 3rd Artillery at Fort Miller, commanded by 2nd Lieutenant Laurette Livingston, along with 30 men of the Millerton Militia, to advance on the Yokuts' fortified position near the Tule River. Alston took the alarming reports at face value. Convinced that large numbers of hostile Indians were lurking in the Tulare Valley, he kept his men under arms for several nights, fearing a surprise attack. He even sent urgent requests for reinforcements and a mountain howitzer, appeals that Beall dismissed as exaggerated. After personally scouting the Kern River country, Alston finally came to a different conclusion. There were no hostile forces threatening Keysville at all. He then sent Sergeant Louis Walton ahead to inform the miners that it was safe to abandon their entrenchments. Meanwhile, further north beyond the Greenhorn Mountains, Livingston's column was engaged in a far more grueling task. Under the May sun, his men struggled to drag a 2,000 olive field gun along the rocky banks of the Tule River and into the foothills toward the Yokuts' hilltop stronghold. The combination of steep terrain, thick brush, and narrow passages soon made the effort impossible. Accepting that the cannon could not be brought forward, Livingston resolved to attack the position without artillery support. Before dawn on the 13th of May, Livingston climbed a nearby rise and studied the Yokuts' encampment. Judging that the position was lightly held on one flank, he quickly set his men in motion. Advancing through brush and low branches, the men's heavy .69 caliber Model 1842 muskets snagged repeatedly, slowing the column to a crawl. Without warning, Yokut defenders rose from concealment and loosed a volley of arrows. Most were deflected by vegetation and caused little injury. Livingston's men answered at once, firing buckshot and ball into the brush, inflicting heavy losses and driving the defenders back as the attack pressed forward. Pressed by disciplined fire and a determined advance, the Yokuts abandoned the position and withdrew into the Sierra forest, where their women and children had already been sent for safety. When the fighting ended, settlers claimed victory, though even their own accounts admitted uncertainty about the number of Yokuts killed or wounded. Several bodies were found within the fortification, and many more were believed to have been carried off through the brush. White casualties were minimal by comparison, reinforcing how uneven the conflict had been once regular troops entered the field. The army of settlers soon disbanded, but the war itself did not truly end. Night raids, retaliations, and forced removals followed, transforming what had begun as a confrontation over rumors and cattle into a prolonged campaign of displacement that would devastate the Yokuts long after the guns and bows on Battle Mountain fell. Silent, the fighting on the Tule River itself lasted only about 6 weeks. When it ended, the Yokuts drifted back into the valley, and for a time there was no collective resistance. Contemporary observers noted that they remained generally peaceful and cooperative, and there was no immediate organized conflict after 1856. Yet this apparent calm masked a deeper unraveling. Disease, displacement, and continued pressure steadily reduced the Yokuts' numbers. More than a decade later, a handful of isolated killings along the Tule River prompted the government to send troops from San Francisco and force remaining groups onto designated reservations. Even then, officials admitted there had been no general uprising, only the lingering aftershocks of a people pushed beyond endurance. In hindsight, even writers of the era were blunt about what the Tule River War represented. It brought little glory to those who fought it and could likely have been avoided altogether. Responsibility was circulated and uncomfortable. Some blamed the Yokuts, but most acknowledged that white communities were far from blameless. As in so many frontier conflicts, fear, exaggeration, and a willingness to resort to violence ensured that moderation never had much of a chance to prevail. The principal figures of the war scattered into very different futures. Lieutenant Benjamin Alston soon decided that Army life in California did not suit him. In 1857, following his father's election as governor of South Carolina, he resigned his commission only to re-enter military life 4 years later as a cavalry general in the Confederate Army. Benjamin Beale, after an honorable Army career stretching back to 1836, retired from active duty in 1861 due to failing health. Major General Patton went on to serve the Union during the Civil War, but later set aside his sword and became a respected poet in San Francisco. Louis Walton, whose ride had helped ease the panic at Keysville, was less fortunate. He lost his sergeant rank only months after the Tule River War and was discharged from the 1st Dragoons on the 21st November 1858. Lorette Livingston went on to command Union artillery during the Civil War and eventually rose to the position of colonel. Among the civilians, William Campbell, despite accusations of fraud as an Indian agent, became a county supervisor. Walter Harvey quietly left the valley and secured government posts elsewhere. Fort Miller was abandoned by 1858 and today lies submerged beneath Millerton Lake, erased by the very development that followed the war. The land itself changed just as completely. Tulare Lake, once the largest body of fresh water west of the Great Lakes and the heart of the Yokuts' life, was drained and diverted for agriculture by the turn of the 20th century. And the lake is no more. The Tulare Valley became the San Joaquin Valley and transformed into an agricultural engine of fields and canals, and with the water went the old world. From an article by History.net, one Chunut woman Yoimut, and I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing it, told historian Frank Latta in 1933 that she was the last survivor of her band. She spoke simply of wanting to go back to Tulare Lake, something she knew would never happen. For the Yokuts, the Tule River War was not an ending, but a turning point of a much longer catastrophe. In the decades that followed, violence, disease, forced labor, and relocation reduced their population by more than 90%. Children were sent to boarding schools, communities were broken apart, and survival often meant working as ranch hands or farm laborers on land that had once been their own. By 1910, only a few hundred Yokuts remained, yet the people endured. Reservations such as Tule River and Santa Rosa were established, and in the 20th century a cultural revival began. Today, thousands of people identify as Yokuts. Federally recognized bands of the Yokuts like the Tachi and the Tule River Indian tribe maintain their communities, language, and traditions. While others continue to seek federal recognition, the Tule River War was brief, but it revealed how fragile peace had become in California's interior. Fueled by rumor, fear, and a refusal to restrain violence, it settled nothing and solved no problem. What it did leave behind was loss of land, of lives, and of a world that could never be restored. I hope y'all enjoyed this episode on the Tule River War. If you did, please leave a like and maybe subscribe. And if you're listening on Spotify, please follow me and give a 5-star rating. It really helps me grow and reach more listeners. Share Wild West deep dives with someone. Join the membership family. For just $1, you'll get access to bonus content like the first stagecoach robbery in U.S. history. We will see y'all next time. And remember, when in doubt, shoot straight, shoot fast. God bless.